Hello, everyone. Hope everyone's doing awesome today. Just to introduce myself really quick, my name is John Ludwig. I'm an international master. I'm playing chess competitively for 16 years now and coaching as well for the last 11 years. And so, really love coaching. I've been taking a break lately from competitive play for the last probably a year or two, just to focus more on coaching as well as other stuff going on in my life. And so, just love teaching chess, love playing it, love coaching, love helping people take that next step. And so, yeah, just jumping into the lesson today. So I was really thinking about, how can I help y'all, take that next step? Like what service can I offer that would help y'all the most? Would it be, going over opening theory, bishop and knight mate, queen versus rook, any different end game or middle game or opening theory that I could discuss any examples there. And while I do think that's valuable, and I could certainly go over some thematic examples like that, I actually was thinking that the best way I could help y'all out is really give y'all some more personal examples of how do I think in certain situations that I faced throughout my 16 years, because 16 years of chess is a long time. Becoming an international master is very, very, very difficult. It was a very long journey that I undertook. And so what did I do? How did I think in these situations, right, where I faced adversity and was able to pull out the win, or if I needed a draw, to pull out a draw? And so, just really want to focus on more of the psychology as well as having that winning mentality to take your game to the next step. Because after all, chess is a very, very strong focus on the mental side. And so, if you have a strong mentality, right, you're confident, not overconfident, but confident, right? You're humble, but you're also very confident, and that will really just help you take that next step, right? And so just want to jump into that here. So I've talked with so many people, so many of my students, and there's always a constant struggle of, I have that underdog mentality when I'm playing a person who's higher rated, whether USCF or FIDE rated, higher rated. I'm like, man, when I'm playing that person, I just feel confident, like, oh, my back's against the wall. I gotta play as hard as I can. I gotta try to get that upset win, that underdog mentality, right? Which is awesome. That's great. I think having that underdog mentality is awesome. But so many times when we play a lower rated player, we don't have the mentality. Right? We have the mentality of, oh, if I lose this game, then I'm going to lose more rating than if I lost to someone who's higher rated than I am, right? So then we start to play a little more timidly, not play with as much purpose, right? Our moves aren't as aggressive, right? Aren't as effective. We don't play it with as effective of plans, and so really the way you need to think about this is I think the way to approach chess with a winning mentality, especially when playing competitively. When you're playing a higher rated player, you need to not have losing on your brain at all. No idea of losing, whether you're playing a higher rated player or a low rated player. You should not have losing at all, right? It's very easy. It's a lot easier to do that when you're playing a higher rated player, because you have the idea in the back of your mind, like, hey, if I lose this game, right, I'm not going to lose as much rating as if I lost to a low rated player, right? So we have this idea in our mind, right? But it doesn't matter if you're playing a higher rated or a low rated player. You should not have losing on your brain at all. Because the moment you have losing in your brain, you start playing not as effectively and you're at an automatic disadvantage compared to your opponent, right? So I think that is very, very important. The most important psychological aspect when it comes to having a winning mentality in chess and taking your game to the next level, right? Because if you need to win a game, right, you should not have losing on your brain at all. That puts you at an automatic disadvantage. You're not going to play as aggressively. You're not going to play as timid. You're going to play more timidly. Your moves just aren't going to do as much. You're just not going to play moves that really seal the deal, right? The only way you're going to win in that situation is more if your opponent messes up themselves, right, and puts them in a worse situation, rather than you putting your opponent in those difficult situations through your aggressive play, through not being afraid to lose, right? So I think that's incredibly important. I think it really makes your play a lot more effective when you have that bold mentality, that winning mentality to take your chess to the next level. And so just wanted to share that with y'all. And so going into some practical examples. So a little bit about my journey to international master. So I became a national master in 2013. And so, a little bit after that, probably 2014, 2015, especially 2015, I was over 2,300 USCF. Actually, 2015, I think I might have hit 2,400 USCF. And that's really when I started thinking like, hey, I need to really start fighting for some international master norms. And so it was a very difficult journey for me to get to that point. And a little bit about me as well. I'm a very consistent player. I know a lot of people have, very like extreme, like awesome performances, very high highs and very low lows. I'm just very consistent. So for me, getting norms is very getting international master norms, the three that are required, was very difficult because I need to have a very extreme, like strong performance to get, to get those norms versus the rating was just a gradual improvement. That was a lot easier for me to hit that 2,400 FIDE rating, which is required for the international master title. So the norms were very difficult for me. And I actually was not able to get my first norm until March of 2017. So I've been trying for over 2 years already to get my first norm. Had a lot of close calls, but just not quite there. And so, and so then I actually got my second norm like only 3 months after that. It was crazy. But then I really hit this lull, after that. And a lot of that was, I was going off to college. I was working, just a lot going on. I just didn't have the time that I really needed to focus on chess. And had, once again, a few close calls with getting my final international master norm. I had already passed 2,400 FIDE at this point, which is the requirement. And so just needed this final norm to clinch my international master title. But it was just very, very, very difficult to hit that. To get that performance, because once again I was very consistent, right? So I was kind of slacking a bit with my play, just with college, everything going on. So really I was like, okay, I need to get in the right place, right, to really clinch this final norm. And so it was end of 2019 when, I've been trying now for over 4 years to get the international master title. So a long time, a lot of hardship there. And so when it came to end of 2019, December 2019, I was thinking I had this one tournament that I was going to play in Charlotte. If I did not, get my final international master norm at this tournament, I was actually thinking of just purchasing the FM title, the FIDE master title, and then basically just retiring from competitive play. And so very thankful that it did not happen. So because I really, really, really wanted this international master title. So with that, there's just a lot going on as well in my personal life. So just thinking like, hey, I need to play well this tournament. I need to play better this tournament than I ever have. And thankfully, that is exactly what happened. And so just a little bit of context for the first example game that I'm going to show here. So this first game, was round 8 of the Charlotte Norman Invitational in December of 2019. At this point, I needed 1.5 out of my final 2 games. 1.5 points in my final 2 games. However, my final 2 games were against 2 international masters. So definitely some difficult competition there. And so this round 8, I was white. So I was like, okay, I'm white. I want to win, right? I need to win this game. I went into this game with the mentality, hey, I need to win. So I'm going to win, right? So I was like, that I think is an incredibly important mentality, because even with that mentality, if you lose that game, it's like, hey, I tried, I played my hardest, and I'm going to take whatever I can learn from that loss and apply that to my next game, right? So and try to win that next game. And so so this game I really needed to win. And so my opponent, his name is Alexei Dioger. He was black in this game, and so. This game, I just wanted this to be a good demonstration to y'all of not only, how you should play when you need to win, and just how to think when you need to win, but also just how freeing it is when, you need to win and you're just focused on playing good moves, right? You're not all worried about opening theory, how much you're prepared, all the stuff. It's like, hey, I want to win, what's the proper, state to be in to win this game, and just going from there. So, so just going into this game, playing as white, e4, g6. So my opponent opens with a modern defense. d4, bishop g7, knight c3, d6. And in this position, I played f4. And funny thing is about f4, I actually don't know this line at all. It's really funny. I have no idea how to play this line. I know some of the ideas, but I don't know any of the particular opening theory. But I was like, hey, I know this is the critical line against the one of the most critical lines against the modern. I need to play aggressively. I need to play for a win, right? I need to win this game as white, so in the final game I can just be more relaxed and just play and draw my last game to clinch the title. So that's why I played f4. And once again, I was like, hey, I know this is I know this is a good move. It's aggressive, so I'm going to play it. And so that's part of the freeing aspect, right? When you have that stronger mentality of like, hey, I need to win this game. So f4, and now my opponent plays c6. Bishop e3, and really quick as well. There's actually a very consistent idea that Black has in this structure of by playing the modern with bishop g7 to attack the center. And so, whether that's e4, d4, any of the pawns like that. So here my opponent goes for d5, sort of a delayed, what's called the Gurganidze structure with e5, this structure with the pawns on c6 and d5, and really just going for light square control, right? F5, G4, all these squares, which my opponent plays H5 here, to really just try to dominate these light squares and make this bishop on E3 as bad of a piece as possible, right? It's basically just stuck behind a bunch of pawns here. So, so a pretty solid line. In general, and this is to help you out if you are ever playing against this line as white. Basically, Black's main idea is to trade off this light square bishop for this knight on g1. So if I played knight f3, my opponent was totally going to play bishop g4 and trade off the knight on f3. The reason for that is because this position is closed, right? And this bishop is a light square bishop, and all the pawns, guess what, are all on light squares. And so this bishop, because all the pawns are on light squares, doesn't have as much open room to really be effective. And so by trading off for this knight on g1, it just leaves the two bishops in an inferior place in a closed position compared to Black's knights. And so Black's usually going to go knight h6, knight f5. Sometimes he even goes e6, bishop g7, bishop f8, and then prepares c5. That way, this bishop on g7 is not a totally useless piece. So so going into this game, I was like, okay, I don't want to allow that trade. I'm not going to give Black what he wants. So queen d2, right? So now if bishop g4, there's no pin. Knight h6, knight f3. So now my opponent continues with this plan of bishop g4. And, the natural move here would be to play bishop e2, which is actually a totally fine move. But I was like, okay, I know what my opponent wants to do, so how do I play against that? I know he wants to trade for my knight and get rid of his bad bishop and play with two knights against in a closed position against my two bishops, which my two bishops aren't very good. So in this position, this is actually probably my second favorite move I played this game, knight h4. I remember playing this move. It felt so good because I was like, oh, this move just feels so nice. It's just a very strange move, honestly, the way it looks with knight h4. But once again, it has two purposes, right? It's number one, preventing the trade of the bishop for the knight. But also, it makes it more difficult because if Black wants to play with his knights, if he wants to put his knight to f5, well, guess what? Now he has to get one of his knights traded because now I control that f5 square. And so loses one of his best pieces. And so I think I definitely like this move a lot. So my opponent actually does go knight f5. Now I trade. Bishop takes. And now that the bishop is not controlling this square on d1, I can now castle. So overall, I think white. I think I have a slight advantage in this position, and so I think here Black has not been able to really play with his knights like he would want to, and I think I have a lot of space here. And I actually also have a pretty consistent idea as white here of playing g3, h3, bishop e2, and then preparing g4 to really try to crack open Black's position and really try to advance, maybe even f5 in the future, right? Kicking the bishop back. And so that's what my plan is. And so my opponent went knight d7, g3, just preparing that. And so once again, just if h3, this is not ideal because then my opponent played h4 and basically fixed the dark squares. So I want to play g3 first. That way, now once I play h3, if h4, I can just play g4 immediately. And so it takes an extra move to go g3, then h3, then g4, but it's worth it because it doesn't allow Black to try to shut down your kingside structure. So g3, b5. Now, this is an interesting point because in this position, like I was saying, I was trying to go for h3, bishop e2, g4, right? But now my opponent plays b5, and now my thought process changed a bit, right? Because I know my opponent is now going for a king side attack or queen side attack on my king, something like b4, maybe knight b6 to c4. But also, if he plays b4, then I have to move my knight, let's say, to e2, and now the bishop comes to e4. And that bishop is very annoying. It puts a lot of pressure on maybe the c2 pawn, attacks my rook. And so I was like, okay, this is annoying. And so here I actually went bishop d3. And so before I was thinking, okay, I want to play against the bishop on f5 with h3, g4, something like that. But now that my opponent is going for b5, I was like, hey, my opponent, yes, he's playing actively, but he's also weakened his position just a little bit by playing b5, weaken the c6 pawn, weaken the dark squares as well. And so even though, yes, I didn't want to trade off the bishops, I'm basically trading off my better bishop in exchange for a more stable pawn structure, right? Because by getting rid of his light square bishop on f5, I eliminate a lot of his activity that he's trying to get by playing b5. So basically trade off the bishops that even though I was trying to play against his bishop, now since he played b5, I'm basically trading one advantage for another advantage. Now I'm going to try to play against the pawn structure. And so we'll see how not having the bishops makes my defense of my king a lot easier, and then I can play against his pawn. So he goes knight b6. I go b3, preventing any knight c4 ideas. e6. Now I take the opportunity to take his bishop. Here he went, Alexei went e takes f5. G takes f5 is okay as well. I do think e takes f5, what my opponent plays, is actually a bit better. I just feel like having more pawns on the king side makes the king feel a little safer, especially if the king does castle. But also, I just think g takes definitely does weaken this h5 pawn. So e takes is, I think, a strong move. And also possibly maybe this knight somehow could get to the e6 square, be a nice blockader, and really make this bishop on e3 even worse. So e takes f5, knight e2. And once again, I think this is one of my favorite parts of the game. I think the way I played the next probably 5 moves was really awesome. Really just enjoyed this. And so, I think knight h4 was strong, but I think this idea that I played here was really strong as well. So I'm playing against what my opponent is doing, but also trying to improve my worst piece, right? So whenever you play chess, improving your worst piece is always a strong idea. Right now, my knight on c3 doesn't do anything, right? Like it doesn't control really any squares. Like it doesn't have really much influence because black controls those squares very solidly. So when I see this knight on c3, I'm like, oh, now that the dark squares have been weakened, right, by black playing b5, how can I get this knight to the c5 square? That would be really nice. And so that's what I went for here in this position. So we have knight e2, a5, king b1, a4, knight c1. So this move, knight c1, does 2 things, right? It defends a2 from the rook on a8 inevitably being opened up after trades. But also, now the knight can come to d3 to c5, which is very strong, or even b4 to attack the c6 pawn. So just a nice maneuver, I think, just preparing to basically attacking and defending and improving the worst piece. So here my opponent goes h4. And now after knight d3, h3. Now, I think this was probably a slight inaccuracy on the part of my opponent. I know what he's trying to do. He's trying to keep me from going h3, g4 by putting the pawn on h3 himself. But the thing is, this pawn on h3 is definitely a target. And if the king ever castles, which happens in the game, this pawn on h3 is pretty much, it cannot be defended. And so, but I do understand what Alexei was trying to do here. So queen e2. Once again, I think this is another very strong move. It has actually 3 purposes. One, it prepares g4, which is always very useful if you can try to crack open the structure on the light squares. Number 2, it actually lines up the queen with the king, so any e6 ideas could possibly be very tricky for black to deal with. But even more important, once again, this bishop on e3 is not a very good piece, right? And so whenever you're playing chess, always think about how can I improve my worst piece and make it more useful, give it more of a place in the game. So now that the queen's on e2, I can actually reroute my bishop to d2 to b4. once again, fighting for those dark squares that were weakened when black played b5. And so the bishop is just going to be awesome on b4. Honestly, playing both attacking and defending on the queen side, so just really awesome. So queen e2, my opponent played queen c8. I think he's trying to prevent me from trying to go e6, and now bishop d2, right? Castles, bishop b4, rook e8, knight f2. So I've carried out everything I wanted to in this game, and now the h3 pawn, like I was alluding to before, is now going to be a big issue, and now I'm just going to take it next move, actually. So very little attack that black can drum up here. For example, like if queen a6, that doesn't really do anything. He's not really threatening to take on b3 because I'm just going to go c takes, and then my queen on e2 guards the a2 square. So also, black's kind of hesitant to open up the c file anyway, because then the c6 pawn is going to be targeted by my rook down the c file. So that's kind of what black is thinking in this position, how we're trying to play and rely on counterplay there. So knight d7 takes, so now I win a pawn. Knight f6. A really cool idea for my opponent, trying to make use of the pin on the rook on the queen, so I can't take his knight right away. And also try to get the knight to e4. So I like this idea for my opponent. So that's why I played knight back to f2, with the idea that I can guard the e4 square, so the knight just can't just jump right in. But also, now that this pawn is gone from h3, I can actually just run my h pawn up the board. And this is actually very difficult to deal with, especially since one of the escape squares for the king is now guarded by this bishop on b4. The f8 square is protected. So if anything does happen on the king side, the king actually doesn't really have many squares to go to. So this is actually just a very bad situation for black. So takes, c takes, rook a6. And now I played h4 in this position. So my idea with h4 in this position was to basically tie this knight down. Like, it would like to go to e4, but as soon as that happens, I can trade for it and then just immediately start running my pawn like I was doing before. So basically, if the knight has to go to h5, which is actually what happens after queen e6, rook d2, protecting my queen, and now knight h5. Now the knight is stuck, on the king side, not really playing an active part in the center. So queen f3, defending g3. Bishop h6, knight d3. Now this comes with a pretty big threat of knight to c5. I picked up the h3 pawn, so now I can free to take over the queen side, and so that's going to come with a big fork on the queen on e6 and then the rook on a6. So queen c8, bishop d6. And now my idea with this is improving my bishop, but also now the knight can not only just go to c5, can also go to b4. Now the bishop has cleared that square, and that's going to be a big threat on the rook and the pawn on c6. So here, queen d8, knight b4, rook b6, rook c2, putting a ton of pressure really on this pawn on c6. And so in this situation, my opponent goes knight f6. He goes for a really cool tactical idea, actually. And so here, I decided to go bishop c5. Now, in this position, knight takes is actually a totally fine move, but I just didn't really like the fact that now that I don't have a knight, I can't really get rid of my opponent's knight on e4 once it jumps in. And this comes with a pretty big threat of knight to d2 check, forking my king and queen. So if I play bishop back to b4, defending the square, my opponent actually has this tricky move, bishop to f8, attacking my bishop. And I can't take it because then knight d2 is really annoying. So I'd have to go bishop back to e1. And now after something like, queen d7, rook c1, this position is winning for me, no doubt about it. I still have ideas of h5. I just didn't like how, I'm up an exchange and a pawn, but I just didn't like this very much because I felt kind of passive here with this knight being so strong on e4. I just didn't like that. Like, I couldn't really challenge that. So instead, in the game, I went bishop to c5, knight e4, takes, queen e3. Now the idea is that, I can use my knight, which actually happens in the game, to challenge the knight on e4 and feeling a lot better there. And so here my opponent plays bishop f8. Just a quick side note, there's actually a cool little tactical idea if rook takes e5. This would be very interesting. I can't take the rook because my queen hangs on e3, and then I can't take the rook with the f-pawn because my queen hangs on e3 from the bishop. So sadly, this doesn't work for my opponent because I just go rook takes c6, and This is just completely winning here. My opponent has to go queen a7 to try to retain the pin on my queen. Otherwise, I just take the rook with a d pawn. But I actually have multiple ways to deal with this. The most effective is likely just rook a6. And now the queen has to leave the defense of the rook on e5 and of the pin, and then allowing me to go d takes e5. And this is just going to be completely winning. So going back here, my opponent went bishop f8, knight back to d3, knight back to f6, knight to f2, preventing any knight e4, knight g4. Now my opponent goes rook e6. And now here, this is where I was like, okay, I'm up in exchange and a pawn. And so how can I really try to close this game out very quickly, especially since I've limited my opponent's play? Here I play h5. Very aggressive, straight to the point. And this is just completely game over, actually. I'm going to crash in on the h file. Something I actually also forgot to mention as well. The reason I played rook d2 originally and then rook c2 is also I could be very flexible with my rooks. I could keep this rook on the h file. I could keep it here, or I could bring it to c1 and double up on the c file, or I could bring the c file rook to h2 and try to really cash in on the king side. And so h5 is just devastating. My opponent goes knight takes. I mean, if g takes, I could just play queen to f3, and the king is just getting checkmated. I'm threatening the knight now on f6, and the pawn on h5 is going to drop. That's very bad. My opponent goes knight takes, g4. And this is just breaking through the position. So knight g7. If instead f takes g4, f5 is actually a very nice overloading tactic. With the idea that if takes, I just go over takes h5, I win the piece, and I'm breaking through. But let's say my opponent just moves back. This doesn't help things either because I can actually still just take the knight anyway. And after g takes, I have queen g5 check. Bishop g7 loses to f6. Followed by mate on g7. And then if king here, I can actually just go knight takes g4. And this is game over. I have knight f6 check coming, as well as if takes, I have rook h2. And this is going to be a very quick checkmate. So just going for a very combative finish to the game. So my opponent, seeing that, he went knight back to g7, trying to hold the f5 square. But now I just go queen h3, and now I'm threatened to checkmate on the h8 here. So f6. And my opponent goes for a really cool final tactical idea. Queen takes d4. And this is a really cool idea from my opponent. Basically, the idea is if I take the knight, bishop takes, and, let's say queen h7 check, king f7, I actually have to be very careful about mating on getting mated on a1. And so maybe this is still playable. Like I could play king c1 and try to run my king, but why go for that? Right? If you have a winning position, a winning initiative, you're already up material. There should be a simpler way to win the game. And so I played here knight d3. My opponent goes queen takes, and now knight e5. So yes, I didn't win a piece, but I got my knight on f2 into the game, very active. And now I'm actually threatening mate again on h8 because now my knight guards the f7 escape square for the king. So really there's no way to protect against mate unless takes. Takes. So now I'm actually up 2 exchanges, and I just continue blasting open the king. Pawn takes. And actually, I should say now my opponent goes for his final tactical idea. Once again, if knight takes f5, queen h7 is going to be mate. So opponent goes knight to h5, just trying to block the h file. But now I just take the pawn, bishop g7. One final try to mate me on a1, but just queen c8. And this is where black resigned in this position. Because now the bishop actually has to move backwards, and now there's no threat. And a pretty simple way to win this position would just be queen to d7 with a threat of queen h7 mate, and there's no good way to protect it. No good way to protect it here in this position. I mean, maybe bishop e7, but now I'm coming in with queen to e8 check, and this is obviously very bad. King g7 followed by queen f7. And this is just game over. If king h8, I have queen h7 mate. If king here, I can just go queen h7, then I could just win the queen and all the material there. So yeah, back here after a queen to c8 check, my opponent resigned, and so this game was really awesome. Very thankful for this game. And so after I won this game, I actually drew my last round and clinched my final international master norm. That allowed me to become an international master after over 4.5 years of trying. And so just a really exciting time. And so this game, the reason I show this game is because I really needed a win in this position, right? And so going into this game, right, all of my moves had purpose, right? Whether it was knight h4, seeing that my opponent wanted to trade his bishop for my knight and play with his knights, whether it was queen e2 to reroute my bishop to b4, or rerouting my knight to d3 to c5, to try to improve all of my pieces, right? And so when you have that winning mentality, right, going into your games of like, hey, I need to win this game, right? And you want to prove that you're the better player, or if you're the lower rated player, right, that you want to prove that you're a worthy competitor, right? And even if you lose, to take that to your those lessons to your next game. And so just having that winning mentality of playing, I think, is incredibly important for just taking your game to that